Okay. So they're organized around the ritual. They're organized around the Agnihotra, the fire ritual, or the Yajna, it's called, Y-A-J-N-A. This was a ritual-based culture. It was a tribal culture. It was a culture that was concerned with social salvation. It was a culture with a high level of orthodoxy. It existed before there was a stronger agrarian society, and definitely before there was a civic society, before there was kind of civilization in cities in the way that we know it. This civilization existed in a feudal era before another urbanization. The Indus-Sarasvati civilization we saw in that first slide, it was a city culture. There were hundreds, actually, of cities along the Indus-Sarasvati River in those valleys, as much as 3,000 years ago. But then those cities died out, partly because the rivers dried up. There was this period, this fallow period, and then we get the period of the Vedas, but these are a nomadic people, and then eventually a feudal people. They're not living in a city culture, and they're describing rituals which are devoted often to war gods or gods of nature, and as, tell me your name again, my friend? Shirish. Shirish said, a lot of them are concerned with everyday life and spells for prosperity or love or even cursing your enemies, but they're full of all kinds of stories, and those stories will eventually be sourced for the Upanishads. But it's a different style of life that they're addressing, and a different way of approaching salvation or the divine. And it has profoundly to do with ritual. If we look at the Rig Veda and the Sama Veda, they're describing rituals in a very, very, very specific way. As my professor said, they took ritual to the level of rocket science. As precise as anything we do today. Like, you had to kill the goat at a certain time, you had to line them up in a certain way, they had to be faced in a certain way. And the mantras, the whole time the priests were giving mantras, and they had to be given in a very, very exact way. In fact, certain priests were assigned to watch the other priests give the mantras, and they had special mantras if someone said those mantras wrong. Because what they were doing, their larger cosmology, their larger philosophy was that they were recreating the cosmos in microcosm. They were creating a holographic form of the greater universe. So, as I said earlier, in the later tradition, the Sri Yantra is correspondent to the goddess. It is the goddess, and it sort of looks like the plan of a ritual if we look down on it from above. That's exactly what was happening in the ritual of the Agnihotra. They were creating the universe in miniature and then managing it. And that's a trope we see again and again and again. It's like magic.
Yeah, also micromanagement too.
Yeah, you look at it as micromanagement. And it has that level of precision, that level of focus. I mean, precision is a huge trope in the tradition. We come back to that again and again and again. I mean, as recently as Krishnamacharya's work, when he was talking about vinyasa. Vinyasa means precise placement. And he took that term from the Vedic tradition. Precise placement. So precision is huge because if you are going to recreate the universe, it's got to be exact. Yeah? It can't be sloppy. It's like building a ship in a bottle, right? Or making a watch. So they had that understanding. There had to be a profound degree of discipline so that what we would call perhaps magic, so the magic would work. So that's this tradition. It's not the tradition of the Upanishads. It precedes the tradition of the Upanishads, and the tradition of the Upanishads will react against this. But this is the basis. Yeah? The Vedas establish the conversation, which eventually becomes Hinduism. There's, of course, that conversation, as I pointed out, begins with some archaeological artifacts that we find in the Indus-Sarasvati civilization in that same part of the world, but there's no text. And we don't know what that script means on those little seals, the tiny little seals, slightly bigger than a postage stamp. So the dialogue in earnest begins with the Vedas. And this is, some people will date the Vedas as far back as 1800 years before the Common Era, sometimes 1500 years, 1200 is the most common date for it. And then after 800, something else happens.
So they're reading and speaking in Sanskrit, that's the language that they're communicating to each other in.
Yeah. And this is, like all traditions at this point in history, it's an oral seen as emanations of the Godhead. And they are the building blocks of reality. They are the sound forms of reality. So, sound is huge in this culture. Later in the tradition, the eyes will become the center of focus. The Hindu tradition will become a hugely visual culture. But that's not the case at this point. At this point, it's a hugely oral culture. Vak, the goddess Vak, is huge in the pantheon. She's huge in the pantheon of gods. Because she is the vibration of the universe. Vak, V-A-C. Vach, actually Vach.
So for such a organized and focused practice and ritual, was there, I mean, I guess just through speculation, was people in a state of samadhi, and that was just the motivation of everyone to participate in such a regiment culture of existence? Or was this everybody, or was this like a group of people that were just focusing on this? I mean, it was a modern, an integral part of their existence?
Well, we can only speculate, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can speculate with some degree of assurance. We can assume that there was nowhere near the degree of individuality that we have today. That arose later on in the Upanishadic era, and it's part of what drives the production of the Upanishads. But this is tribal culture, and the terms of survival are much more stark. So you don't have people running off because there's such a surplus of wealth and a surplus of opportunity and surplus of possibility and reflection on possibility. People running off and doing different things. It's pretty much, this is what we do. And if you want to survive, you're going to do this, right? And we see that in tribal culture generally. Tribalized mindsets, different ethical systems that relate specifically to the tribe, different patterns of behavior which are specifically tribal. So that's the kind of culture we're looking at. And if we're talking about development of the human psyche, these people live in dream time, much more in dream time, what we call dream time, timeless time, cyclical time. We live in a critical physical sense of time. We live in a timeline. They live in time as a circle. So that too is not something that is determined by the life of a single individual. The cyclical time has to do with the survival of the tribe, which constantly regenerates itself. And the same archetypes in the human life, in the individual life, are lived out again and again and again. So it's not like this is a culture which encourages departures from tradition and existence. It's profoundly orthodox.
But it's also pretty sophisticated. I mean, the Rig Veda, the poetry is pretty, they're all between, I never got very clear about it's instruction for the priests, but it's by the poets or by the priests who are poets, and it's linguistically very elaborate and playful and complicated.
Yeah, what she's saying is very true. Poetry is operating at a very high level intellectually. I mean, the degree in which it plays with ideas as to what the gods are, what the cosmos is, what the roles of the individual is, are how the elements of the ritual interact and how they behave, and they're all personified. Right? Fire is personified, the butter that they throw on the fire is personified, the act of surrender is personified. There's gods for all these things. And then, as you say, that if you read something like the Rig Veda, those things are played with in really elaborate and often confusing ways to the modern mind. I mean, it's hard to decipher all the symbolism in those things. But yeah, there was a profound degree of sophistication in the Vedas. And that's partly why the Vedas have retained their authority in the Hindu tradition. A lot of people don't read the Vedas, it's just referred to the power of the Vedas. When you do read them, though, there's a heck of a lot to discover. But because of their sophistication, they're given a special value, and I think that's on the next slide. No, it's not. Okay, we're going to stay on that slide for a moment before we go to this slide. They're seen as, so just go back. They're seen as being channeled by the seers, and they're seen as being timeless. They did not arise from any point in history. The Vedas always existed in some other realm. It's just that the seers were able to drop into a certain mystical state and witness their already perfect condition, and then speak them to from the Vedic seers, and the seers saw something that was iconic, that existed outside of space and time, but they brought it into space and time.